Your Bibles to Luke 10. Everyone's got a Bible now? Yeah. So Luke 10 demonstrates the power of God working through the disciples. It shows the 72 given authority to do 4 things. Verse 5. Offer God's peace. Verse 9, heal the sick. Verse 10, proclaim God's kingdom. And finally, verse 17, drive out the demons. That, essentially, is the what of this passage. The overall action of the 72. The next question is how? How do the disciples do these 4 things? Offer peace, heal the sick, proclaim God's kingdom, and drive out demons. We can find out the how by looking at 5 operative words or verbs in this passage. The verbs are appointed, sent, ask, go, finally, do not. 2 of these verbs are in the passive tense, appointed and sent, meaning it is an action that has been completed. It's already been done. To put it more simply, they have been appointed. They have been sent. The 3 other verbs are in the imperative. Ask, go, do not. Imperatives are commands. 2 of these are positive. One of them is negative. Verse 2, ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. Verse 3, go, I am sending you out like lambs among wolves. And verse 4, do not take a purse or bag or sandals, and do not greet anyone on the road. The last imperative, a warning really, a prohibition, is the most interesting. It is the most interesting because it's the least likely to be heard. The next important question is who? Who are we talking about? Who are the 72? Who are these people going around offering God's peace, healing, kingdom, and powers of exorcism? Who are these people? First of all, the number 72 is not meant to be taken literally. There may have been 72 of them at one time, but that is besides the point. Why? Well, the number 7 is a common symbol in the Bible to illustrate completion, fullness, and perfection. The most obvious example being 6 days of creation and the 7th day of rest. So God marveled on the 7th day. He rested on the 7th day. He's done. Jesus is therefore proclaiming that the complete number, the full number, the perfect number of his disciples will do these things. offer God's peace, heal, proclaim his kingdom, and exorcise demons ahead of him. The number 2 signifies how Jesus, in verse 1, sent them 2 by 2 ahead of him to every town and every place he was about to go. And the second answer to the who question is Jesus himself. He is the other character in this passage. Even though he seems to play a relatively minor role in the action of his disciples, everything depends upon his actions. Jesus is the one that appointed, sent, and instructed the 72 disciples. If not for Jesus, there would be no disciples or followers. Without someone to follow, there would be no appointed, no one to send, and no one to instruct. These purseless, bagless, and sandalless disciples. Last of all, verse 1 says, Jesus sent them 2 by 2 ahead of him to every town and place where he was about to go. Therefore, even though we are so keen to focus on what the disciples do, their work is merely anticipatory, preparatory, and a foreshadowing of Jesus' own ministry. The main character is, not so surprisingly, Jesus. The problem, however, like me, many of us are quick to see ourselves as the main actors in this story. We want to jump in to the story and see how we fit in, which isn't abnormal. It's just problematic when we get in the way. And the last question to ask is when? Why does this story matter to us if it's all in the past, some 2,000 years ago? Is Jesus just talking to these disciples some 2,000 years ago and not to us? There are a couple hints that suggest that Jesus is talking to all of us, in fact. From the original 72 to today, to all Christians until he comes back. First of all, the big picture of Jesus sending the 72 anticipates something much greater than they or us can imagine. Jesus speaks about a metaphorical harvest. This whole story is about God as a landlord, or the Lord of the harvest sending out workers to the field. You may think, oh, that's just a metaphor. But precisely because it is a metaphor, we should pay careful attention to what he means. Such as, who is the Lord of the harvest? Who are the harvesters? And what is the harvest? Well, I just gave you the answer to the first one. Obviously, Jesus is the Lord of the harvest. The 72 are the harvesters. But what is the harvest, you may ask? What is the crop they are reaping? Funny enough, Jesus never says clearly what it is. Is it wheat? Is it barley? Is it fruit? Well, that's actually a trick question, because the harvesters are the harvest. What do you mean by that? In verse 20, Jesus says, "Do not rejoice that the spirits submit to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven." Jesus is saying it's about his harvest, about saving souls to go to heaven. So don't be so proud of your own work. Only the Lord can make this harvest grow. You're only reaping the crop. You see and benefit from what the Lord has already been doing. Jesus is therefore not talking about just the original 72. He is talking about everyone. Everyone who is a genuine Christian. Those who are disciples of Christ. Those who are sent by Christ. Therefore, Jesus is speaking to us directly. He's speaking to us directly about those words of being appointed and sent. If you are a disciple of Jesus Christ, you have been appointed and you have been sent. Sent to be harvesters of his kingdom. Each and every one of you. Likewise, those words of asking and going are true. If you feel inadequate, good. Jesus calls you to ask. Ask for wisdom. Ask to be equipped. Ask for discernment. Ask for direction. And if you ask, you will receive. Because the Lord makes the harvest grow, not you. Matthew 7:7 says, "Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you." And so therefore, the answer Jesus gives you is an emphatic yes. Yes, I will provide you with what you need. Yes, I will give you more generously than you can imagine. God is a giver of abundance. Again, Matthew 28:19-20 says, "Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." Likely, there are two opinions floating around right now. Those who feel inadequate and those who feel equipped. Perhaps you feel that you're a new Christian, or don't have a very good command of the Bible, or don't have any seminary training. You know you are called to participate. You know all Christians are asked to build God's kingdom on earth. That's why Jesus tells his disciples to pray, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." However, you feel you don't have the tools, whether you might call it in Christianese, spiritual giftings, or whatever. Jesus reassures us that you have every advantage that God can provide. The original disciples were a ragtag bunch, a humble bunch, a poor bunch, an assuming bunch of fishermen from a small Nazarene village. They were economically under the poverty line. Probably didn't have much of an education, weren't particularly bright, and certainly didn't catch or recognize much of what Jesus did or said. However, they were a humble bunch of peasants, and that's why they were chosen. In perhaps every culture and every social setting, it would be unusual to boast about one's weaknesses. but Jesus encourages it. Why? In verse 4, Jesus, as I said before, has this very interesting imperative or negative command. Do not take a purse or bag or sandals. Why? Why does he say that? Because pride comes from a sense that I can do things without God. And precisely this command is to do with God and the resources he has to provide. Part of the problem is that we're often quicker to boast about our strengths, giftings, and education than we are with our weaknesses. We are ashamed or unaware of our own problems. Perhaps a broken marriage, poor social skills, workaholism, or idolizing sports and private lessons for kids. In many ways, this shows that do not take a purse or bag or sandals. Shows that God wants us to bring these areas of weakness or inadequacy to him rather than just our gifts. This kind of reminds me of someone I know, namely myself. I was so eager to boast about how smart I am to my mentor, so that he might approve and accept me. Funny enough, he refused. Flat out rejected talking to me about that. Talking about academics or theology or more school. Rather, he wanted to just sit down with me about my problems. The last thing I wanted to talk about. I honestly felt so embarrassed, naked, and a bit ashamed. Like a sharp knife. He cut into my personal bubble about things I wasn't even aware of and frankly didn't want to talk about. Problems of emotional brokenness, where this obsessive compulsion to find approval comes from. Why I'm neglecting my marriage. I could go on, honestly, but I won't. He showed me that fatherly approval does not come from performance. He showed me that theological education is like a double-edged sword. It can be a tool for God's kingdom to build it up. Or it more often is a tool to build my own pride. He also showed me that disregarding education is another form of pride. Like I don't need it because I'm better than it. He gave examples of famous theologians, pastors, and other Christians with great public images, but broken personal lives. A lot of what he was trying to tell me is that the strongest people are not those with good public images, those that can boast about their strengths. High education, big churches, seniority in churches. It's those people that have wrestled those battles behind the scenes with their spouses, their children, their integrity, their honesty, their sense of peace in God's presence. What does true courage look like? It's not the people that just work on their giftings, strengths, and education because they're good at it, because they're in their comfort zone, because they're proud of it. The courageous are those that face dangers, face the shameful, face the challenging. My marriage, my emotional weaknesses, my insecurities, my blind spots, my character flaws. At least that's what James was most interested in. And I think as he prayed in his heart while we had all those meetings, there is a bit of Jesus' heart in that attitude. Therefore, you cannot follow this command, do not take a purse or bag or sandals, if you are calling yourself to do God's work. Self-appointed, sending yourself for your own ego mission, asking yourself about your own intellectual resources or techniques. We can only be appointed and sent if we wait for Jesus. Likewise, we only see a need to ask and to be sent if we are humble enough to need his help. The problem that this passage identifies is that you might hate me for this, actually. The problem is that the most education you receive, like my sometimes prideful self, or the more years you've been attending church or being in church leadership, or the more people that have told you that you're gifted intellectually or pastorally or respected because of your seniority, the more likely you brought along stuff when Jesus said, do not take a purse or bag or sandals. I might say to myself, Chris, you've done youth ministry for 5 years. Oh, you've got Bible school under your belt. You've got a head on your shoulders. Perhaps you could do ministry by praying, asking, and waiting for God a little less. But the pathetic thing that happens is that it no longer becomes Jesus' calling, Jesus' appointment, Jesus' equipping, Jesus' guidance, Jesus' authority. It turns into something quite evil, actually. It turns into my calling, my appointments, my equipping, my experiences, my guidance, my authority. Sounds familiar? Well, after all, we live in the I generation of the iPhone and the iPad and the I whatnot. I matter the most. Me, me, me. At least as a millennial, I do. It no longer serves to build up God's kingdom. Only our own rebellious rival kingdom to God's. Our kingdom of self-importance and pride, mind you, with the same sense of calling, theological education, many years of ministry. The good thing about feeling inadequate, in fact, is that you'll usually feel like you're not up to the task. You'll ask around, perhaps read a book or two, and you'll certainly pray if you feel desperate enough. And you'll wait on God to help you. After all, if you did bring your purse or bag or sandals, do you think you'd be up to the task of providing God's peace, healing, kingdom of heaven, exorcism, or saving souls, for that matter? Do you think you'd be up to the task? The issue, therefore, of not bringing your purse, bag, or sandals is really about authority. Once we start claiming that the spiritual authority comes from our own intelligence, competence, or spiritual giftings, seniority, or whatnot, we immediately become prideful and ineffective in ministry. What this phrase, "do not bring your purse, bag, or sandals," means is not that we ought to turn off our intellect or forget about theological education or wisdom from age or not identify gifted ministry leaders. No, it's quite the opposite, actually. We should do these things with this in mind. You should never forget the role Jesus has called all of us to play. All equally important in his eyes. Forget about putting people on pedestals. Forget about self-congratulatory pats on the back. Forget about feeling good about how smart, educated, middle class you are. Jesus can do great things with mustard seeds. And he can knock down giants like Goliath with pebbles. Jesus can very well do whatever he wants with both your weaknesses and gifts as he wants. He is, after all, the one who has given you the calling and gifts. He is, after all, the one you're preparing for to come later. He is, after all, king of this kingdom you're supposed to be building. We can put off the YouTube clip, please. If anyone's a Spider-Man fan, you might recognize this one.
Downtown library. I'll see you later.
Yeah, wait, Pete. I'll drive you there, buddy.
Well, I'll take the train.
No. I need that. Go on. Go.
Thanks for the ride.
Now, wait a minute. We need to talk.
Oh, we can talk later.
We can talk now. You let me.
What do we have to talk about right now?
Because we haven't talked at all for so long. You're Aunt May and I don't even know who you are anymore. You shirk your chores. You have all those weird experiments in your room. You start fights at school.
I didn't start that fight. I told you that.
You sure have finished.
Well, what's I supposed to do? Run away?
No, you're not supposed to run away. Pete, look, you're changing. I know I went through exactly the same thing at your age.
No, not exactly.
Peter, these are the years when a man changes into the man he's going to become the rest of his life. Just be careful who you change into. This guy flashed front. He probably deserved what happened. Just because you can be doesn't give you the right to. Remember, with great power comes great responsibility.
Are you afraid that I'm going to turn into some kind of criminal? Quit worrying about me, okay? Something's different. I'll figure it out. Stop lecturing me, please.
I don't mean to lecture, and I don't mean to preach. And I know I'm not your father.
Then stop pretending to be.
Right. I'll pick you up here at 10.
How often are we like Peter Parker with all of our excuses and interrupting his uncle and just not letting him talk? So prideful. And how is God like his uncle, pleading with him to just say a word, cautioning him, telling him about the dangers of his powers, and just the sadness and disappointment he has with his nephew's lack of respect and regard. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12:9, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me." After all, Jesus gives us the perfect model of what this means. Being born in a farmhouse to a blue-collar stepfather, doing ministry to the poor, disabled, and finally dying as a rebel. What an insignificant, shameful, and lowly existence Jesus had. One we are told to model. Precisely because it's like that, it is the cross that we should look up to. For Jesus, like his command to not take purse, bag, or sandal, lays everything down. He lays his whole life down that he may take it up in glory. You now understand why Jesus says, "Do not take your purse, bag, or sandals," and then later rejoice that your names are written in heaven. Only if you lay down your self-importance, pride, age, ministry experience, education, will you be lifted up. After all, the last will be first, and the first will be last.